We have indicated before that the standard response to exceptions in organizations is what we would call the let's not witch hunt syndrome, which basically means that when something goes wrong, the average boss's response is not to find out who did what, but is to impose another control. This leadership diagnostic methodology that we're going to explore in this process is concerned with giving us a technology whereby we can deal with exceptions appropriately. It's based on a consulting experience I had with an organization called NCS in the 90s. I first met the MD of the business, who was clearly a very distraught man, trying to sell him some leadership work, and he had absolutely no interest in what I was trying to sell him. I asked him then, what the issues were, and he said, well, fundamentally the overall performance of the business was really bad, that his shareholders had him on a line, and it's quite likely that he could lose his job. I then asked him if I could sniff around the organization a bit, and he was quite comfortable with that idea. The reasons why the results were so bad is that the cash flow of the business was in crisis, and the cash flow was the preserve of the accountant. And if you drilled into the cash flow problem, what became apparent is that the debtors book, which was the preserve of the debtor supervisor, was very far behind. And it was far behind because the handover and the collection, which were both the preserve of the debtors clerks, were not to standard. Basically, the collection, which was supposed to happen in 45 days, was happening in 60 days plus, and the handover was way over 120 days. Now, handover is a legal process whereby a debt is given to the attorneys for legal pursuance. Now, both of these two measures were so far out of line that the debtor supervisor was constantly in crisis. In order to deal with the crisis, the debtor supervisor instituted something called a red list. The aim of the red list was to identify those debts that had gone for longer than 45 days, which the clerk would then add those debts to the red list so that the debtor supervisor could pursue them. Now, the problem with having done this is that there's so many debts that ended up on the red list that the supervisor was just critically behind. So her strategy to make sure that the collections came in was making the situation worse rather than better. I then brokered a conversation between the debtor's clerk and the debtor's supervisor, basically indicating to the debtor's supervisor that she should ask the debtor's clerk why she hadn't collected in 45 days. And the debtor's clerk said, well, what do you mean, why don't I collect in 45 days? My job is not to collect in 45 days. My job is to move the debt onto the red list in 45 days. The debtor supervisor said to the debtor's clerk, make absolutely no mistake, it's your job to collect in 45 days. Second to this, the debtor supervisor then asked the debtor's clerk about the handover. Why aren't you handing over at 120 days? And the debtor's clerk said, well, I know I should hand over in 120 days. The problem is that every time I want to hand over a debt, the sales director comes into our area, takes the documentation off my desk, tells me to stop upsetting his customers, and leaves with the documentation. In other words, what the debtor supervisor should be contributing in this particular instance is that she should give the debtor's clerk a means, a standard, to collect in 45 days, and a further means, which would be the authority to withhold the documentation from the sales director. Now, the reason why this didn't occur to her in the past is because what she was being challenged on by the accountant was the debtor's book. And the debtor's book was clearly the results piece that was concerned with her activity. So what the accountant was doing by asking her that is that he was focusing her attention on what she was getting. What the accountant should have been asking the debtor supervisor is what's going on with your clerk, because then he would have focused her attention on what she was personally contributing rather than the results she was getting out. He would have been able to help her to establish that in fact what was at issue was that the clerk wasn't given an appropriate standard for collection and that the clerk didn't have the authority to withhold documentation from the sales director. Having now established what the debtor supervisor should have given the clerk in the past, the accountant then indicated to the supervisor that she was perfectly aware that the clerk should have collected in 45 days. So in a sense, what she did was below standard. So he censured her for not having given the clerk the appropriate means. What also became apparent, though, is that he couldn't hold the supervisor accountable for the fact that the sales director was taking documentation out of the area. So his role would be to give the debtor supervisor the authority to get rid of the sales director. Now, the reason why the accountant didn't do those two things is because in the past, The question that he was being asked by the CEO was basically what's going on with the cash flow. And as a result, the CEO was focusing the accountant's attention on the cash flow, and the accountant was spending all of his time trying to mollify a bank manager. By asking the accountant about the cash flow, what the CEO was doing is he was focusing the accountant's attention on what he was getting, which was out of his hands. What he should have asked the accountant was, what on earth is going on with your debtor's supervisor? Because if he had done that, he would have focused the accountant's attention on what he personally contributed to the situation. So the accountant then indicated to the CEO the product of our conversation. He indicated that he had discovered that the debtor's supervisor had not indicated to the clerks that they should collect in 45 days, but that it indicated to them that they should move the debt onto the red list in 45 days. The CEO was horrified. He said, "What did you do?" The accountant said he censured her. And then the CEO asked, "Well, is there anything else that's happened there?" And the accountant then said, "Yes, well, there is this issue of the sales director taking stuff out of the area, and that the supervisor doesn't have the means to tell the sales director not to take material." So the CEO was delighted that the accountant had censured the supervisor appropriately, and he praised him. But he wasn't satisfied with what the accountant was saying about this issue of the authority. So he asked, "Well, what exactly have you done?" And in fact, the accountant had done nothing, because the problem here was that the sales director was actually the accountant's friend. So in this instance, the CEO censured the accountant for not having confronted the sales director. So what becomes apparent is that when you focus your subordinates' attention on the results area, which is what happened here, the effect of that is that you take their attention off what they should personally contribute. And the effect of that is that all of the strategies that you engage in order to address your results problem actually entrenches the problem, because they're all cosmetic. The debtor supervisor's institution of the red list was a cosmetic way of dealing with a problem that the debtor's clerks weren't collecting in 45 days. So based on this NCS experience, we developed an instrument which is concerned with helping one to unravel the command issues that sit behind an exception. One starts off by trying to understand what the exception actually is all about. So you ask the question, what is the exception? Who did what to cause the exception? And as you can remember, when we examined the NCS example, what we had established was that the overall business performance was poor. And this was because the cash flow was in crisis. And the cash flow was a product of the debtor's book being behind. And the debtor's book was behind for two reasons. First of all, the clerks were not collecting in 45 days, which was the main issue. And the subordinate issue was that the clerks weren't handing the long overdue debts to the attorneys on time, because the sales director removed documentation. Now, when you do a leadership diagnostic, you can only do a leadership diagnostic on one root cause at a time. So the first thing we're going to look at is the issue of the debtor's clerks not handing over in 45 days. So the specific cause was that the clerks were not collecting in 45 days. Clearly, this was done by the clerk. Now, what the next piece of this instrument requires you to do is to work out why this was the case. Did the person do the right thing? In other words, did the clerks collect in 45 days? Because if they had, clearly they should be recognized or awarded. And if they hadn't done the right thing, one should consider whether this was a means or an ability issue. And if those two things were in place, then in fact the person involved should be either censured or punished. So what this instrument gives you is a multiple choice of 6 possibilities. One has to commit to one. Now, in this instance, the reason why the clerks were not collecting in 45 days is that they didn't have a clear standard to do so, which basically means the problem lay at the level of means. And clearly what they required was a clear standard to collect in 45 days. And the person who should be giving that to them would be the supervisor. And the question is, had the supervisor done that? And we discovered that, in fact, the supervisor had not done that. What the supervisor had done was established a red list. And in this particular case, the supervisor was aware that the clerk should be collecting in 45 days. So in this case, the supervisor clearly did have the means and the ability to give the clerks a standard to collect in 45 days, and she hadn't, which basically means she should be censured. So she required a verbal censure, and the person who should give that to her was the accountant, And the accountant did in fact do that, which basically means that the accountant should be recognized for doing the right thing. He should be praised by his boss, the MD, who did so. If we now look at the issues that sat behind the handover problem, that the handover wasn't happening in 120 days. Clearly the people at issue again were the clerks, and they weren't doing the right thing. In this particular case, they weren't doing the right thing again for a means reason, because they didn't have the authority. So what they required was clear authority to withhold documents from the sales director, and the person who should give them that authority is their boss, the supervisor. Now the question is, had the supervisor done so? And she hadn't. But in her case, it is because she herself didn't have the authority to withhold documentation from the sales director. She didn't have the means. So she, in a sense, required exactly the same authority as her subordinates did from her boss, the accountant. Had the accountant given her that authority? No, he hadn't. And the reason for this was that he and the sales director were friends, which basically means that in this particular case, the accountant should be censured. He should be given a verbal warning. And who should give him that was, in fact, his boss, the MD, who did do that. So what the leadership diagnostic instrument allows one to do is it allows you to unpack what the command issues are that sit behind an exception whenever it happens. So one doesn't just deal with things that go wrong from the point of view of instituting more controls. One deals with them appropriately by understanding who contributes what. And the effect of that is that one's fix then becomes systemic and not cosmetic.